On a chilly spring morning in April 2002, a duck lands outside Norwalk Superior Court, Connecticut. Inside the court, prosecutor Jonathan Benedict and defense attorney Mickey Sherman are busy selecting jurors for the upcoming trial of Michael Skakel. Dubbed the East Coast OJ, and consisting of many of the same characters as OJ trial, the dramatic court finale of a 27-year mystery is brewing behind the scenes. Michael Skakel is accused of murdering his neighbour, Martha Moxley, in 1975, and his trial has come as a shock to almost everyone. Martha was a 15-year-old child in 1975. Had she lived, she would have been 42 in 2002. Could justice really be delivered after all this time? Benedict is confident that they have the right man, and Sherman is just as confident that the state don't have a case. It's been 27 years, fading memories, deaths of key people in the investigation. Will time itself be a factor in this case? Is there enough reasonable doubt? Or has the answer been hiding in plain sight for almost 30 years, and finally the world is going to know the truth? The duck is unconcerned with these matters. She has her own business in the court gardens. It's time for her to become a mother. But her fate is weirdly connected to Michael's. Legend has it if a duck lays her egg near the court, the state wins all their cases. Mickey Sherman scoffs at this adorable story and jokes about sending the, quote, Kennedy goons after the duck. It's a good thing that Mickey Sherman is not superstitious, because the duck, she laid 14 eggs. Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to provide a full account of true crime stories. If this sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This is episode 10 of the series The Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley Murder. In our last episode, we discussed Michael Skakel's memoir tapes that added to the growing circumstantial evidence against him. In this episode, we are going to have a brief look at what happened with the grand jury, and then a full breakdown of the trial. 1998. The grand jury began at Fairfield County Courthouse, Connecticut. It lasted 18 months and consists of Judge George N. Thim listening to 50 witnesses giving evidence related to Martha's murder. The judge had to decide whether there was sufficient evidence to prosecute Michael Skakel for the murder of Martha Moxley. Much of the evidence he heard we have discussed in the previous 2 episodes, but I will talk about some of the events during the grand jury process. Among the witnesses called, there were witnesses to the events of Mischief Night, like Andrea Shakespeare Renner, who thought Michael had not gone to the Terrians the night of the murder, and Michael's former best friend, Andy Pugh, who had long suspected Michael had killed Martha. Michael's associates, like Father Connolly, who was told by Councillor Ilan that Michael remembered being covered in blood the night Martha was killed, and was himself so frightened of Michael's temper that he had not been honest with the police about the Skakel boys' fixation with Martha. Richard Hoffman, Michael's ghostwriter, who had unwittingly recorded important clues about the night Martha died, was also called to testify at the grand jury, as well as multiple Ilan patients like John Higgins, who claims he heard Michael break down and confess that he did it. Due to the pivotal testimony of the Ilan patients, the founder of Ilan, Joe Rishi, received a subpoena to testify. He refused, citing, quote, privilege. Rishi believed that his therapy and treatment programs and any related information were private medical information and should not be made available to the court. This led to subsequent hearings to decide if his records were outside of the court's jurisdiction. Eventually, he did testify in September 1998. According to Timothy Dumas, when he spoke with Rishi about Michael for his book Greentown, Rishi denied knowing anything about the rumours of Michael killing Martha. He said it was not mentioned to him and he was not told anything about the confessions, etc. He also made some hideous comments about his former patients, basically indicating that they were all unreliable liars. Which I find interesting because, of course, many of them all say the same thing, that Rishi not only knew about these rumours, but he had accused Michael of killing Martha in front of them at group meetings in Ilan. Ken Littleton was also called to testify at the grand jury. He attended in August 1998. He was an extremely reluctant witness. He pleaded the Fifth Amendment, which is the right to not answer questions, thus refusing to testify. His refusal came from an absolute paranoia about the Skakels and their Kennedy family members, as well as mistrust of the police and the state attorney. Ken had been plagued by various law enforcement officials since Martha's murder, and he was terrified to even be involved in the process of another person being held accountable, especially a Skakel. From his perspective, he was putting a big target on his forehead one way or another. Now, Jonathan Benedict had anticipated this, and he used Ken's fears to his advantage. By encouraging Ken to plead the fifth, he created a process called transactional immunity, where the judge would order Ken to testify, but in doing so, Ken gets immunity from any prosecution in connection to the crime, as he has lost his right to not self-incriminate. So even if one day it was discovered he was Martha's killer, or assisted in some way, he would never be charged, which left him free to speak about what he knew, without fear the police and prosecution were going to try and set him up again, like the false confession story. This was of little comfort to Ken, though. As protected as he was legally, he was still living in fear of retribution from the Skakels and Kennedys. He had been living with this issue for years. He truly believed the Kennedys were after him and were wanting to kill him. So much so that when he was violently mugged in some seemingly unrelated crime, he thought the Kennedys were behind it. And that was before he testified against their family member. So you can imagine the state he was in while the grand jury continued through 1999. Almost a year after he testified, he was living in constant fear of vengeance from the Skakels and the Kennedys, and he was in the middle of a psychotic episode, his mental health still being frail in the 90s, while this grand jury continued. Then, on the 21st of July 1999, Littleton attempted suicide. He stabbed himself and cut his wrists. Luckily, he was found in time and survived the attempt, but this incident left people questioning his guilt. There are rumours he burned a diary, and this very violent suicide attempt came after he was publicly removed as a suspect. So, did this mean that he got away with murder and the shame and guilt led him to try and commit suicide? According to Ken, he tried to commit suicide because he thought the Kennedys were trying to kill him. On the day of his attempted suicide, he had noticed weird fumes and smoke coming into the apartment. There had been a generator that was parked outside the building causing this, but Ken was unaware of that, and in his paranoid state he thought he was being gassed by the Kennedys, that they had finally come to kill him. Unexplained noises in the building and the unknown generator outside, combined with Ken's psychosis and his brain being overrun by caffeine and lack of sleep. In fact, he had been deliberately ingesting high doses of caffeine to stay awake because he thought the Kennedys were after him. In these circumstances, you can imagine his brain just leaping to that conclusion, and he tried to control what he could by taking his own life before the Kennedys could finish him off. The diary he burned was in fact an address book. He destroyed it so the Kennedys could not go after his family and friends. Such a tragic story, living with that kind of fear. But Ken survived his suicide attempt, he got some support and his mental health improved. And then 6 months later, the announcement came that the grand jury was complete. 19th of January 2000. Almost 25 years after Martha was killed, Jonathan Benedict makes his announcement at the Bridgeport Holiday Inn. The grand jury had found probable cause for arrest, and they had a warrant out for someone who was a juvenile at the time of the murder. The juvenile in question, Michael Skakel, was now almost 40, and already flying to Connecticut by the time his arrest was announced. It would be 2 more years before the courtroom drama played out. So now we fast forward from January 2000 to the summer of 2002, and let's talk about what happened at the trial. Prosecutors Jonathan Benedict, Susan Gill, and Christopher Morano have to put forward a case without forensic evidence like DNA, no eyewitnesses to the crime, and a 27-year gap between the murder and the prosecution. It's not an easy case to prosecute, but there was a lot of circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence cases can really help juries to understand the crime better than scientific evidence. Technical, legal, or forensic jargon can be boring or confusing, whereas circumstantial cases form a picture that is easy to see, and the evidence can be easier to follow as it's more relatable. It's like the difference between people sitting through a really intense lecture on a very specific and specialised area of science versus watching a soap opera. Regardless of your own intelligence or understanding of academics, most of us will be able to follow a soap opera easier than an in-depth scientific lecture in a field we are not familiar with. So when presenting evidence at a trial, it's really important to not lose the jury in those kind of details, especially when they are also expected to weigh that evidence against everything else they've heard and work out what is the most critical thing that determines their understanding of guilt or innocence. And that's where a circumstantial evidence case like Michael's can win, as the story is easier to follow and the jury understand what is happening and can reach a verdict, or at least know what they're confused about and what they need to discuss in deliberation. The evidence used to prosecute Michael can be divided into 3 categories. Number 1, Michael's connection to and access to the murder weapon on the night of the murder. 2, his many variations of his story of what happened the night Martha died. The details were always different, and yet every time he placed himself at the scene, despite simultaneously claiming that he was at the Terrians and then went straight home to bed, and being, quote, blackout drunk and thus unable to remember anything. He still kept telling these various stories about the night he doesn't remember. And number 3, his statements over the years that incriminate him, including one such statement that could be construed as a full confession. To the jury, all those accounts of Michael confessing to the crime or varying stories placing himself at the crime scene could seem compelling. It's a story they can follow. However, they might view the patients from Milan with suspicion, due to the history of drug use and in some cases their own checkered pasts with law enforcement. The defence said they're all unreliable, so would the jury believe them? Reliability was not the only issue. Greg Coleman, who had heard Michael confess and also claimed to be able to avoid jail due to his Kennedy status, Mr. Coleman had testified to this at the grand jury, but unfortunately he died from a drug overdose between his testimony at the grand jury and the beginning of the trial, and so was unable to testify at the trial. His evidence was read out in court to the annoyance of Mickey Sherman, Michael's defence lawyer, who resented not being able to cross-examine Mr. Coleman. He viewed him as unreliable due to his drug addiction, and he wanted to present that on cross, but the court would only hear Mr. Coleman's words and not Mickey Sherman's attempts to discredit him. Mickey was critical of all the Elan witnesses and doubted their credibility and wondered how it would play to a jury. For example, Dorothy Rogers had been arrested in 1980 for burning down a house, which is when she told police about Michael being connected to the murder. That she'd heard Elan staff accuse Michael of the murder and then questioned him herself about what happened. If you recall from a previous episode, Michael explained to her that he was a suspect when he wasn't, and that he had a blackout from drinking alcohol that night and wasn't sure if he killed Martha. So he was advised by a family member or attorney to attend Elan to avoid murder charges. For me personally, the timing of this statement legitimises it. 1980 was just 5 years after Martha died and at least a decade before Michael was a suspect. Dorothy Rogers had told the police a story that fit with reports from other witnesses about him confessing and being accused by Elan staff. In addition to this repetition, you have the detail about a family member or attorney, which we know from Michael's book notes rings true. Thomas Sheridan, family friend and lawyer, had dropped him off at Elan. Even if she was trying to escape trouble for herself, it doesn't make what she was saying any less accurate. In fact, lying to them about something this significant would not help her case at all. Any leniency she could have expected would go out the window. More importantly, she volunteered this information to officers who were not familiar with or investigating Martha's case. It was unlikely she was coached or encouraged to talk about it. However, Mickey Sherman thought her and many other witnesses were not going to help the state's case simply due to the history of problems, leading the jurors to ignore or reject what they were saying. The court heard testimony from John Higgins, confirming that Michael broke down and confessed. And they also heard from Liz Arnold, who testified about her conversation with Michael, where he couldn't remember what happened, and that he or a brother may have killed her, and that his brother had had a sexual interaction with his girlfriend. And by girlfriend he meant Martha, the victim. The defence, and later Robert F Kennedy Jr., would claim that the so-called confessions at Elan were invented by drug addicts. And yet they also claimed that Michael was told at Elan that he needed to confess to Tommy's involvement as a condition for his release. According to RFK Jr., Michael was harassed and frightened and that he was, quote, sensitive, and these confessions were coerced. I would agree that some statements made at Elan could have been classed as coerced confessions. If, for example, Michael claimed to have killed Martha after being hit 5 times in the face in the boxing ring, I would say we could all ignore that. Most of us would say anything to avoid being repeatedly punched in the face. That would be a coerced confession, so we could all ignore it. However, these statements appear to be made during private conversations where he was being questioned by fellow patients one-on-one, not under public scrutiny or any kind of pressure. In fact, in those scenarios where he was under public scrutiny, he denied it. So he could have just said no to any of these people and been consistent with his answers. But he told them all variations of the same theme. He might have killed her, but he can't remember, and that he was there that night and assumed a suspect, despite claiming for years that he wasn't there, and the police not labelling him a suspect in 1978 when he was talking to these witnesses. I think it's safe to listen to these stories and look at what they say collectively. These people did not get together and try to fit Michael up for a crime that he hadn't even been accused of. They clearly all heard similar stories from him, and that's why they told the police. Some of them only coming forward years later, when they realised what they knew after seeing the Unsolved Mysteries report on TV. And as for Robert F Kennedy Jr. telling people that Elan forced Michael to confess on Tommy's behalf, I don't even know what the hell he is talking about. Elan's staff were not working for the police investigating Martha's murder. They were hired by Michael's own family to deal with Michael's alcohol issues and as a punishment for criminal charges from the car accident. At least that's the official story. The other reason appears to be that the family knew or suspected he had killed Martha and wanted him out of the way of the police and getting help. So why on earth would his release depend on him confessing that his brother committed a murder, which the family publicly allege neither boy was involved in? And why would Elan make that a stipulation for his release? So let's look at this another way. If he was in prison for some random crime, and a police officer or prosecutor came in, and they said, look, I can get you early release, or I can move you to a better prison if you tell me what your brother did to Martha, then that story would make sense. Quid pro quo. Information for early release. But Michael was in a private hospital undergoing rehab, booked by his own family. Why would his family request that the staff force him to confess what his brother did? Or why would the staff decide he had to do that to get released when Martha's murder was nothing to do with Elan? It makes no sense. And even if, for some insane reason, the Skakel family had asked Elan staff to get Michael to confess that Tommy murdered Martha, why then did Michael start confessing himself rather than naming his brother as the killer? What absolute nonsense is this? Robert F Kennedy Jr. has been talking bullshit his entire life. There is no way that this is true. There is no way that it was a condition of his release to confess to Tommy doing the crime and then for some reason changing that to himself. It's absolute nonsense. So aside from the Elan patients and the so-called coerced confessions, we've got the testimony of Larry Zaccarelli, who, if you remember, had dealt with a hysterical and suicidal Michael whilst working as a chauffeur for the Skakels. Michael claimed he had done something so awful that he needed to flee the country or die. And he would not elaborate on what he'd done because, quote, if you knew, you would never talk to me again, end quote. Larry testified to this in court, and as always with circumstantial evidence, this particular piece of information wasn't necessarily damaging all by itself, but within the context of Martha's murder, it seems to hint at a confession. The really important point here, though, is that this was 2 whole years prior to any confessions or similar statements that he made at Elan. Michael's erratic behaviour that day was long before he was a patient at Elan, where, as we've just discussed, according to his cousin RFK Jr., he was under pressure to confess. Yet here he is seemingly confessing to something awful 2 full years before being admitted to Elan. So why was he doing that before being, quote, bullied at Elan? If the Elan confessions were coerced, and about Tommy, what was he talking about with Mr. Zaccarelli? So whatever the defence team and the Kennedys say about the Elan witnesses and their credibility, Their statements just lined up exactly with what the court heard from everyone else connected to this case, which must have made them look more credible to the jurors. One witness that Mickey would struggle to criticise was Andrea Shakespeare Renner, who took the stand to confirm that she had thought Michael did not go to the Terrians the night Martha died, thus dismantling his alibi. Andrea Shakespeare Renner is a nightmare for Michael's defence. She was still good friends with the Skakels, and unlike some of the other witness counterparts, had almost nothing negative about her life that could be used against her. Even her family were beyond attack, as her father was an ambassador to the Vatican. Her holier-than-thou credentials aside, I think the optics of someone close to the Skakels, who has maintained a good relationship to them over the years, has no axe to grind with them or anyone else, and who was definitely there the night Martha was killed, who doesn't have a history of drugs or crime or any connection to the murder, she has no reason to get on that stand other than to tell the truth. And she sits there and confidently claims that she, quote, knows that he didn't go to the Terrians that night. I think that says a lot to the jury. But Andrea was not the only star witness. Ken Littleton did surprisingly well given how stressful this whole process had been for him. He and his ex-wife Mary Baker were called to testify about the confession lie that Jack Solomon had used to try and get Ken to confess to the crime. This part was known as the Ken Littleton trial. It was important to show that the prosecution was confident that Ken was not the perpetrator after all the years he had been harassed by both law enforcement and the Skakel investigators. He was the only alternative the defence had as to who killed Martha. There was no other suspects than Tommy, who realistically they did not want to throw under a bus or hint at yet more Skakel involvement. That wouldn't play well to a jury. Best for the defence to stick to Ken Littleton. So the state needed to get out in front of it. In addition to calling Ken as a witness about what he knew, they needed to deal with Jack Solomon's investigations and why the prosecution was no longer interested in him as a suspect, thus stopping the jury from having reasonable doubt that it could have been Ken. Jack Solomon basically perjured himself on the stand. He said Ken did confess to killing Martha, despite Mary testifying that the confession was a lie that was concocted by the Connecticut officials. Mrs. Baker said, her quote that I mentioned before, quote, "I have respect for the police and I wanted to help them," end quote. And she told her story about how she was told to lie to Ken, say he had confessed to killing Martha years earlier, and then see what his response was. So after, quote, consulting his notes, Jack Solomon went back on the stand and said that Littleton hadn't confessed. In court, Jonathan Benedict referred to this attempt to get Ken to confess as, quote, "the most bizarre piece of investigative work I've ever encountered," end quote. And so ended the mini-trial of Ken Littleton. Jack Solomon and Frank Garr were reprimanded for nearly eliciting a false confession, which looks terrible for law enforcement. But at least the jury would know that despite the Skakels trying to pin this on him and Ken Littleton being hounded by authorities for years, he was not the person who killed Martha and had never confessed to doing so. The state's case ended with the recordings of Michael made by ghostwriter Richard Hoffman. The court hears Michael describe in his own words the night Martha died and his nighttime wanderings. However, the alarming memories that he has of that night were somewhat overshadowed. The people in court were more reacting to Michael discussing on tape how much he missed his mother and was looking for her in the women that he stalked that night. Between his boyish voice and the obvious pain he still carries regarding his mother's death, he was seen as a sympathetic character rather than people noting the discrepancies and the potential clues in what he was saying on that tape. People have criticised the state's choice to rest this case on that particular note. The state's case was seen as a bit of a swing and a miss. Jonathan Benedict was criticised for not being a particularly aggressive prosecutor. He seemed laid back about it all. There was also key points that got missed out. Christopher Morano failed to mention the tree Martha was found under and its connection to Michael, and then emphasised the significance of that to the jury. It was just completely missed when he had Andy Pugh on the stand. Larry Zaccarelli's testimony was seen as Michael reacting to the dress incident, where he was caught with his mother's clothing, and not him confessing to a murder. So overall, people were critical and concerned about how the jury would view this evidence. But little did they know that Jonathan Benedict had a Hail Mary pass he was saving until the very end. Let's move on to Michael's defence. The duck progeny prophecy should have been a warning to Michael about what was to come, as nothing about the start of the trial went his way. Judge Maureen Dennis was trying him as an adult instead of a juvenile. Michael was only 15 when Martha was killed, but the judge felt it was prudent to try him as an adult. In fairness to the judge, it was not her fault he was almost 40 when he finally sat in a courtroom. Judge Dennis also denied Michael's claim that the alarm witnesses needed to be taken out of the state's case. His defence claimed that their testimony was confidential due to it being made during therapy sessions in a medical environment, and stated it was unreliable due to the methods used at Elan and the lack of credibility of the witnesses themselves. The judge dismissed this, and the Elan patients testified. In more devastating news, Michael's wife had filed for divorce. Michael had married Tom Sheridan's niece, Margot, and they had a young son. Michael was stressed enough about not seeing his son if he was found guilty, and now he had lost his wife before the verdict was even in. Michael himself did not come off well in the press or the court. Unfortunately, he'd seemed like a stereotypical rich white guy getting away with something, and people resented him for it. Mickey Sherman knew this did not play well in the court of public opinion, especially as Dorothy Moxley was so charismatic. Watch any interviews with Mrs. Moxley and you will love her. She was an adorable lady and had such grace in such horrendous circumstances. Meanwhile, according to Len Levitt, Michael was threatening Frank Garr in court and muttering nasty comments about everyone who testified. Absolute charmer. Still, the presentation of the state's case had not gone particularly well. From a defence attorney's perspective, even if the prosecution's case is perfect, you don't need to challenge every point or produce alternate theories, or even present the defendant as a nice person. All you need to do is create reasonable doubt. Mickey Sherman believed that there was already reasonable doubt. Michael was not the only suspect, and in fact he had been overlooked as a suspect for many years due to his supposed alibi. People like Tommy and Ken Littleton were good alternatives. The prosecution's case had other problems too. Despite having one of the best forensic experts of the era, Dr. Henry Lee, look at the case, there was no forensic evidence linking Michael to the scene. So his many stories about meandering through the crime scene were irrelevant, as there was nothing proving he was there at all. And according to Sherman, the witnesses hearing these stories were not reliable. He believed that people with problematic lives and addictions would not play well to the jury, as we've already discussed. So Mickey Sherman's defence case was built on the premise that Martha died around 10 p.m. when Michael was at the Terrians' house. Any admissions about being there or being involved were made under torture and duress whilst he was at Elan, and can be ignored due to them being false confessions that were witnessed by unreliable people. The juxtaposition of Michael being a poor, tortured innocent, but all the other Elan patients referred to as unreliable monsters really bugs me. It's so hypocritical. Michael was in Elan due to having an addiction to alcohol, thus making him as, quote, unreliable as the other patients were accused of being. On top of that, he was sent there after a horrific car accident where he broke a girl's leg and left her in a damaged car and showed absolutely no remorse for what happened. We of course know that the other unofficial reason for him being sent to Elan is that he was either known or suspected of killing Martha on top of these issues. So how is he the innocent child and all the other people are worse than him? If we are going to judge people based on them being at Elan in a really reductive, old-fashioned view of mental health and criminal responsibility, then Michael has to be treated with the same lack of trust. He should be considered as dangerous and unreliable as he and his team accuse all these other people of being. It is even more insulting that Robert F Kennedy Jr. claims these people are untrustworthy when he himself had an addiction to heroin for 14 years. And every word that comes out of that man's mouth is literal nonsense. Which is not surprising, given that his wife recently gave an interview on TV where she claims his brainworm ate a small part of his brain and then died. Really? Did it? A worm ate part of his brain. These are the people we are supposed to trust as authorities on Martha's murder. The brainworm people. They want us to believe that they are more trustworthy than recovering addicts, whilst also being recovering addicts who talk about brainworms and link autism to circumcision and Tylenol. You don't have to be a detective to figure out that the brainworm starved to death. But before I start on what is sure to be a 10-hour rant on RFK Jr., let's save that for the final episode. For now, let's go back to Michael's defence. Let's talk about Mickey Sherman himself, as he's actually quite fascinating. Aside from being a defence attorney in the, quote, East Coast OJ trial for Michael Skakel, Mickey has a few other claims to fame. Mickey Sherman also grew up in Greenwich, but without the money and the prestige of the families living in Belle Haven. After graduating law school, he set up his own practice in 1976 and achieved some fame as he was often featured on TV. Mickey Sherman is charismatic, witty, confident, and he has some interesting celebrity friends. Apparently, his best friend is Michael Bolton. Yes, the Michael Bolton. And in one of the most surreal life is stranger than fiction moments, he had a front row seat to the O.J. Simpson case due to his connection to Michael Bolton. When Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered in June 1994, O.J. Simpson's girlfriend at the time, model Paula Barbieri, was in Las Vegas. And according to Dominic Dunn, Paula received a phone call to tell her about the crime when she was sat on a sun lounger next to Mickey Sherman at the Mirage Hotel, as they were both, quote, guests of Michael Bolton. So he witnessed it, the start of that insane case. And that's how he knew Dominic Dunn, as they were both connected to OJ's case, with Dominic Dunn reporting on it for Vanity Fair and Mickey Sherman giving analysis of it on TV. Mickey's connection to Dominic Dunn annoyed Robert F Kennedy Jr., as by the time of Michael's trial, Dunn was seen as an enemy of the Skakel Kennedys after the book he wrote about Martha's case. Obviously, Dunn is sat in court on the other side of the prosecution and has publicly accused Michael of killing Martha, whilst simultaneously being friends with Mickey Sherman. For some reason, RFK Jr. didn't like that. Mickey Sherman's approach to Michael's defence was that he firmly believed in Michael Skakel's innocence. He described him as a, quote, lovely man, and said that he didn't do it. Pro tip. Most defence attorneys are aware of their client's guilt, or at least know it is a possibility, and just do what they can to mitigate the sentence or even get them off. They do their job because A, the police do not always get it right, people are wrongly accused all the time, and B, everyone is entitled to a good defence, regardless of guilt. But mostly they know it's just about protecting their client's interests rather than fighting an injustice. It's incredibly problematic for people who find themselves falsely accused, as not even their defence attorneys believe them. Most defence attorneys are very cynical people who've seen it all and heard it all before. They have to defend a mafia boss the same as if they were defending a teenager who accidentally killed someone with bad driving. It's about tactics, not necessarily truth. Wrongly accused or guilty, doesn't matter. It's about getting your freedom. Attorneys who believe their clients are few and far between, and often only believe certain clients who fit the most extreme circumstances. So for Mickey to believe Michael, if he truly does, is significant and kind of surprising to me. His defence of Michael begins with him establishing his alibi for the suspected time of the murder. According to the defence, Martha died at 10 p.m, and the most likely culprit was Ken Littleton. He calls to the stand James Terrian Dowdall, or Jimmy Terrian as he was known in 1975, along with Michael's siblings, John and Rushton Jr., who went to the Terrian estate that night, for them to confirm that Michael was with them until the Skakels returned to the house together at around 11 p.m, at which point Martha was allegedly already dead, thus Michael was not the killer. They all remembered key details about Michael being at the Terrians and watching Monty Python, but when it came to any other questions about that night, they answered with, I can't recall, or I can't be sure. So to be clear, they remember specific details about the part that confirms Michael was not in Belle Haven that night, but cannot remember anything else to do with the night Martha was killed. One could blame poor memory, it's given the 27-year time span, but this seems very selective and convenient. Especially as Martha's family and witnesses like Ken Littleton and Andrew Shakespeare Renner remember the night as a whole, despite it being 27 years ago. When someone is murdered and the police consistently ask you questions about what you and everyone else was doing, you tend to have that locked in your mind. It's suspicious to suddenly forget half of it. When Jimmy left the stand, Michael told him, good job, and went to hug him. Jimmy refused the hug. Jimmy's mother and Michael's aunt, Georgianne Terrian, also testified. She claimed she didn't see the children in her house, as she was in the library with her partner and was unaware who else was in the rest of the house at the time. So she confirmed her nephews came over, but not specifically placing Michael there. Julie Skakel testified to say that she could not remember much. She left the house at 9:30 p.m. to drive Andrea home, and then forgot her keys. So Andrea went back to the house to collect the keys, as we know. Julie then stated that while Andrea was gone, she saw her brother Tommy saying goodbye to Martha at the side of the house. When I was reading this, I realised that this actually contradicts Tommy's account that he and Martha had hung out longer and had a sexual encounter, which is what he claimed in the 1990s. We know that Tommy handed Andrea the keys. Everyone's confirmed that. But did Martha leave then? Or did she hang out with Tommy a bit longer? This discrepancy is important as the motive for the crime appears to be Michael's jealousy about Tommy and Martha being intimate. If Martha left the house at 9:30 p.m, and her and Tommy didn't hang out, then where is the motive for Michael to kill her? Either Julie was lying to protect Michael, or Tommy was lying in the 1990s, when he claimed that him and Martha were intimate and that she left closer to 10 p.m. My money is on Julie not being honest, as the rest of her testimony also doesn't fit the events of the evening. On the stand, she stated that she saw a figure dart past her car, the one she shouted out to, saying, quote, "Michael, get back here," end quote. Then she saw Littleton and Tommy open the door to give Andrea her keys. She confirmed that the figure darting past her car was prior to seeing Tommy and Martha by the side door, and then said, quote, "I don't think it was Michael," end quote. Okay. She also stated that she saw Ken Littleton at 10 p.m. and that he had changed his clothes. She did concede that she had never mentioned this observation to the police at any point, or during her testimony to the grand jury. So, in short, these little changes look like she was modifying her accounts of what happened that night to look better for Michael. Mickey Sherman also called some Elan patients of his own to the stand to testify that the ones who were witnesses for the prosecution were all liars. Sherman was confident he had enough reasonable doubt for the jury, that the state hadn't really proved its case, and that his witnesses could prove that Michael wasn't there. So the defence rested. But before we get into the summations, there is one interesting point I should make about Michael's defence. His family, and by family I mean the Kennedy portion, encouraged him to make a plea deal. Yep, you heard that right. According to Dominic Dunn, after allegedly outing him as a killer to the newspapers to divert attention from his cousin Michael Kennedy's scandal with the babysitter and to discredit Michael Skakel in the eyes of the public, and then changing their stance completely when he was arrested for Martha's murder, the Kennedys insisted that Michael now was not a killer and that he was innocent and the police had it all wrong. So after all of that, behind the scenes, they were telling Michael to plead guilty to the crime. Why? Well, my conclusion is that it had to do with protecting the family name. Morty's. That's Morty jumping on the sofa in the background. Back to the Kennedys. My conclusion is that they were trying to protect their family name. Their motive seemed to have nothing to do with the truth or the abstract concept of justice. They were just changing their opinion based on what benefited them. By pleading guilty, Michael would have faced a quicker route through the justice system. No drawn-out salacious trial which publicly announces everyone's dirty laundry, less media attention, less mention of the Kennedys in connection to the murder of a 15-year-old girl. The Kennedys were worried that Michael's connection to them would be the leading headline, and as the Kennedy name had already been attached to Martha's case by mistake, the last thing they needed was this brought up again. Now, there are reasons to plead guilty that could encourage people to do so, even if they are innocent. By pleading guilty, you usually have a reduced sentence, or something like the death penalty is taken off the table. Police and prosecutors offer plea deals for lots of reasons. Sometimes if they're worried about the strength of a case, but believe they have the right person, so they want to bypass the risk of a mistrial. Or they use it to get key information from a suspect, i.e. tell us where your victims' bodies are and plead guilty and you will see leniency at your sentencing hearing. An incentive to help the victims' families or to make things quicker and easier in court. An innocent person would not be able to give them details on bodies and would usually want their day in court if they sense the prosecution doesn't have a case. But guilty people can bargain for an easier sentence. So someone pleading guilty is usually guilty. But in cases where someone has been wrongly accused, they may decide to do that if they fear they can't defend themselves, if they don't have any real evidence to contradict the state's case, or if they're found guilty and the penalty would be so high that they're frightened and would rather take their chances with a shorter sentence. So that may sound crazy. I mean, why would anyone plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit? But people who've been wrongly accused of murder have been executed for it, and have then been pardoned posthumously when the real killer is caught. So you can see how someone in that position may stand their ground and confirm they're innocent and be like, I'm not confessing to anything that I didn't do, and then hope the truth comes out. But they would have to deal with the consequences of that choice. If they're found guilty, they could be completely screwed. Whereas somebody could choose to plead guilty despite being innocent just to have some form of control or autonomy over the situation. So getting back to Michael, would the Kennedys encourage him to plead guilty even if they believed in his innocence? It's possible. He could get a shorter sentence, avoid publicity, etc. But in this instance, it would appear to be more about avoiding the press fallout than really caring about guilt or innocence. Because if privately they're encouraging him to take a deal and then publicly declaring his innocence, it seems more about keeping a lid on it rather than actually believing him or wanting him to pay for his crime. They're kind of playing both sides to find the quickest way to avoid scandal rather than protecting his interests or caring about the victim. And I want you to remember this flip-flopping in the next episode when I will address the claims that Robert F Kennedy Jr. has made about this case in his book. Put your Maltese clue paw print on the plea deal ready for a deep dive on this nonsense. The final arguments in a trial are usually a great opportunity for each side to reiterate their key headlines to the jury. They repeat and reinforce the most important testimony and the most important evidence to keep it fresh in the juror's mind, ready for deliberation. Which is what Mickey Sherman did. He reminded the jurors that the state's case raised a lot of questions about the night Martha died, and that his client had an alibi and was not in Belle Haven at the time it was best guessed that Martha died. He also challenged the idea that the Skakels had known and covered up the crime. He said it was the, quote, worst run conspiracy, end quote. Well, I can agree with him on that at least. After Jonathan Benedict's performance during the trial, people were unsure how much the jury would really connect to the state's case. Would a jury see what all the people invested in the case had come to realise? Or would they have doubts that Michael was the killer? Even people like reporter Len Levitt had questions about whether the state had really explained everything and answered every question. He had spent 20 years researching that case and still had questions. Would the jury be able to process all this information correctly and in such a short space of time? So there were doubts. That was until Jonathan Benedict's summation. He dropped a bombshell that caused an audible gasp in the courtroom. Jonathan Benedict began by confirming that there was questions left unanswered about the night Martha died. The exact time of death is unknown, for example. But as he pointed out to the jury, the autopsy confirmed it was between 9:30 p.m. and 5:30 a.m. And so the exact time didn't matter. The crux of the case was that everything came back to Michael, and his whereabouts that evening, which had varied so much over the years that it was hard to know what the truth was. But when you put it all together, Michael told us exactly what happened to Martha. Benedict explained the Moxley property and crime scene in detail. He outlined where Martha was found and the trees outside Martha and John's windows. He then described the events of the evening leading up to Martha's murder and highlighted what he believed kicked everything off. When Tommy got into the Lincoln car and interrupted, quote, Michael's big moment, end quote, with Martha. The trip to the Terrians occurred shortly after, and once the car had left, the next event was Andrea Shakespeare being driven home by Julie. While sat in the car, Julie had yelled after a figure running past her car and called the figure Michael. The next day, after Martha is found dead, Michael tells Andrea and Julie and says, quote, Martha is dead and Tommy and I were the last ones to see her, end quote. Benedict next moves on to Michael's comments over the next 2 decades about the murder. He summarises it as this list. 1976, less than a year after Martha is killed, he tells chauffeur Zuccarelli, I have done a terrible thing. You wouldn't speak to me again if you knew it. I have to kill myself or get out of the country. 1978 or 1979, he tells Dorothy Rogers that he was in a blackout and he might have done it. He tells Greg Coleman he can get away with murder because he is a Kennedy. He confesses and breaks down to John Higgins. And then in 1982 he confesses to his father, who tells Sissy Ix. In 1985 he tells Michael Meredith he was there the night of the murder and climbed a tree to spy on Martha, blaming his brother in the process. In 1992 he told Andy Pugh a similar story, but in the version he told Andy he placed himself in a different location, the tree that Martha's body was found in. Since October 31st, 1975, either Thomas or Michael Skakel was a prime suspect in this case. Quote, "It has been one of the most notorious cases in the country's history. Their neighbour, playmate, who was murdered. No one in the family remembers anything." End quote. Next he talked about how Michael was a troubled teen, an alcoholic with bouts of violence, and that his family couldn't find a way to control his behaviour. And how, on the night of the murder, Andrea Shakespeare was sure he didn't leave Belle Haven to visit the Terriens' house, and that his sister Julie saw a figure run past her car and thought it was Michael. Then he comes to his bombshell. Using Michael's own words from the memoir recordings, Benedict states, quote, "the fact that gives the lie to his entire alibi." End quote. On the recordings, Michael said, quote, "I got home and most of the lights were out. I went walking around the house. Nobody was on the porch. I went upstairs to my sister's room. Her door was closed, and I remembered that Andrea had gone home." End quote. Benedict continued in his summation, quote, "On supposedly getting home from the Terriens, he goes to his sister's room and remembers then Andrea has gone home. But the car had departed for the Terriens before Julie and Andrea had stepped foot out of the house to take Andrea home. Somebody who actually left already would have no idea of Julie's trip to take Andrea home." End quote. So what Benedict explained was that, in his own words, Michael had placed himself at the Skakel home at exactly the time he was supposed to be at the Terriens' house. In witnessing Andrea's departure from the property, it confirms that he did not go to the Terriens as he claimed. In his book on the case, Len Levitt remembers how this caused a gasp in the courtroom. This offhand remark by Michael in his book recordings was overlooked by most people, but it did seem to confirm that he'd remained in Belle Haven the night Martha died. Benedict continues by pointing out that Michael is the only Skakel who has memories in, quote, "cinematic detail" of the night of the murder, at least in his book notes. And yet decades earlier, when he was being questioned in Elan, he claimed he couldn't remember anything. He was blackout drunk. Benedict also states that only the killer would have gone to the places Michael claims to have gone that night, and only the killer would have woken up in a panic the next day. As Benedict was laying out his points, he had an audiovisual aid for the jurors. He played the recordings that Michael had made for his memoir, while showing photos of the crime scene and Martha's body. He put quotes from what Michael was saying across the pictures to link them all together. There was a photo of Martha dead on the ground with the text, "I just remember a feeling of panic," while the court could hear Michael's own voice repeating the words. Mickey Sherman called it subliminal messaging, but in reality it was a great way to illustrate how much Michael's own words had led people to the conclusion that he had killed Martha. Put that with his admission that he knew that Julie had taken Andrea home, and thus placing him at the scene, the summation was a masterclass. You were left with no other alternative. The confessions, the changing stories, the murder scene. We may never know the full details of what happened to Martha on the 31st of October 1975, but it is clear the killer was Michael. To quote Frank Garr, "It's Michael, it can't be anyone else, it's him." End quote. The jury agreed. On Friday the 7th of June 2002, Michael Skakel was found guilty of murdering Martha and taken immediately to prison. A day the Moxley family will never forget. After 27 years, Martha finally had justice. To quote Dorothy Moxley, "This is Martha's day. This is truly Martha's day." End quote. The Skakels were not giving up, though. Michael's sentencing hearing was scheduled for August 29th, 2002, and they wasted no time in drumming up support for him. The judge was presented with letters about his character from many family members and prominent people, like his Aunt Ethel Skakel, who was both. The letters described an almost saint-like Michael, who was a devoted father and an all-round good Samaritan. Robert F Kennedy Jr. wrote an article in Atlantic Monthly insisting that Michael was innocent and the most likely killer was Ken Littleton. Yes, in 2002, RFK Jr. was still trying to claim that Ken Littleton murdered Martha after he'd been publicly acquitted. Michael pleaded for leniency. He claimed he was innocent and weirdly compared himself to Jesus. I mean, because obviously he does. Finally, Dorothy Moxley had her say. Mrs. Moxley was always incredibly kind and dignified through her years without Martha, but the trial and sentencing was an opportunity for her to share her grief. Her anger was more directed at the people protecting Michael as a child, which had led to this 27 years of further pain and suffering for her family. Which makes sense to me. Michael was a neglected and abused child, which led to his behaviour, and his family either wittingly or unwittingly refused to hold him accountable. Dorothy asked for the maximum sentence. Quote, Michael sentenced us to life without Martha, so it is only fair he serves a similar sentence. End quote. Judge Kavanewski agreed. Michael Skakel was sentenced to 20 years to life at the McDougall-Walker Correctional Institute in Connecticut. At his first parole hearing in October 2012, he was still protesting his innocence, which did not help him get parole. A precondition for possible early release was showing remorse for what he had done. Michael couldn't even admit to it, much less apologise. And so, here we are, 10 episodes, and we finally solved the mystery of Walsh Lane. Michael is in prison after 27 years. That's it, right? That's all she wrote? Nope, there's another episode to go. In 2003, Robert F Kennedy Jr. and his brainworm announced that he found someone who knew who really killed Martha. 3 young men who were not even supposed to be in Belle Haven the night Martha died. So what did this mean for Michael's case? And were the suspects the real killers? Find out in episode 11 of A Mystery on Walsh Lane, The Martha Moxley Murder. Thank you for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Goodbye from me, and goodbye from Morty.